There's a particular kind of exhaustion that builds in anyone who has spent months, sometimes years, pouring visible, deliberate effort into a relationship with an avoidant partner, only to watch that effort seemingly disappear into a void, unacknowledged, unreflected, sometimes even unnoticed, thoughtful gestures, patient explanations, careful, well-timed reassurance. All of it offered with genuine care, and all of it, more often than not, met with the same distant, unmoved response as before. This isn't because the avoidant partner is incapable of appreciating care. It's because effort, in the specific form most people instinctively offer it, was never actually the thing their nervous system was scanning for. If the listener has felt this particular exhaustion, wondering why so much visible effort seems to produce so little visible change, this exploration is going to name exactly what an avoidant partner is actually responding to and why it looks almost nothing like what most people assume. To understand why effort so often fails to register the way it's intended, it helps to understand what an avoidant nervous system is actually built to monitor. Most people, when trying to reassure a partner, focus on demonstrating investment, on proving through action that they're committed, that they care, that the relationship matters enough to warrant sacrifice or accommodation. This instinct makes sense in most relationships because most people respond to visible effort with corresponding trust and warmth. Avoidant partners operate through a different filter entirely. Their nervous system isn't primarily scanning for evidence of investment, it's scanning for evidence of safety. And these two things, investment and safety, are not the same, and often aren't even correlated in the way most people assume. This distinction matters enormously because effort, especially intense or frequent effort, can actually read as a threat rather than a comfort to an avoidant nervous system, depending on how it's delivered. A partner who tries harder, who reaches out more, who explains more thoroughly, who plans more elaborate gestures, is often unconsciously signaling something the avoidant partner's defenses interpret as pressure, an escalating expectation that intimacy is deepening at a pace their nervous system cannot safely absorb. This is why so many well-intentioned attempts at connection produce the opposite of their intended effect: more withdrawal rather than less, more distance rather than reassurance. The effort itself isn't the problem. What the effort often unintentionally communicates is the problem. It's worth pausing here to name something directly for the listener who has felt confused, even hurt, by watching their own genuine care seemingly backfire. That confusion makes complete sense because most relationship guidance operates on the assumption that visible effort naturally builds trust. With an avoidant partner, this assumption often doesn't hold, not because the effort wasn't real or valuable, but because the avoidant nervous system evaluates relationships through an entirely different lens, one built around threat detection rather than investment recognition. Understanding this distinction isn't about abandoning care altogether. It's about understanding what specifically an avoidant partner is actually responding to underneath the surface, so that genuine care can be offered in a form their nervous system can actually receive. So what exactly are avoidant partners scanning for, if not effort itself? The answer centers on something closer to predictability of emotional response. Specifically, whether a partner's emotional reactions remain steady and proportionate regardless of what happens within the relationship. This matters more than almost anything else, because an avoidant nervous system has typically learned, through earlier experience, that emotional reactions from important people can be unpredictable, disproportionate, or overwhelming, and that unpredictability itself is what makes closeness feel dangerous. A partner who reacts to conflict, disappointment, or distance with wildly fluctuating intensity, sometimes calm, sometimes furious, sometimes desperate, sometimes withdrawn, confirms exactly the pattern an avoidant nervous system is primed to fear. A partner whose emotional responses remain relatively steady across a wide range of circumstances offers something far more valuable to that nervous system than any single gesture of effort ever could. This is worth exploring in more detail because steadiness doesn't mean suppressing genuine feeling or performing constant calm, regardless of what's actually happening internally. It means something closer to emotional proportionality, responding to genuinely serious situations with genuinely serious concern, while not escalating minor disappointments or ordinary relational friction into intense emotional events that require significant management or repair. An avoidant partner learns over time whether a given partner's emotional weather is predictable or volatile, and this learning happens far more through repeated observation than through any single conversation or gesture designed to communicate reassurance directly. Predictability, built slowly through many small interactions, tends to matter more than any individual instance of effort, however sincere that effort might be. There's a second element worth naming here, closely related to predictability, but distinct enough to deserve its own examination. Whether a partner's love appears conditional on the avoidant's own behaviour remaining consistently open or engaged. Many avoidant partners have learned, through prior relationships or through early family dynamics, that affection tends to recede the moment they show any sign of needing space, distance, or independence. This creates a specific kind of vigilance, watching closely for any sign that warmth is contingent on continuous engagement, because confirming this fear gives the avoidant partner justification for the guardedness they've already built. A partner who continues offering steady, unconditional warmth even during periods of the avoidant's own withdrawal, without that warmth curdling into resentment, guilt-tripping, or subtle punishment, communicates something an avoidant nervous system finds difficult to disbelieve once enough evidence accumulates, that love here doesn't disappear the moment distance appears. It's worth exploring why this particular signal carries so much more weight than effort typically does. Effort, especially effort concentrated into specific gestures or grand displays, is relatively easy for an avoidant partner to dismiss or discount because it can be attributed to a specific mood, a specific occasion, a temporary surge of investment that doesn't necessarily reflect an underlying sustained pattern. Unconditional warmth extended consistently across many different circumstances, including circumstances where the avoidant partner has pulled away or behaved in ways that would understandably strain patience, is much harder to dismiss this way, precisely because it can't be attributed to a single mood or moment. It requires sustained pattern recognition over time, and sustained patterns are exactly what an avoidant nervous system has learned to trust more than isolated, however sincere, gestures. There's something worth naming about how this reshapes the entire concept of what trying actually means within a relationship with an avoidant partner. Trying, in the conventional sense most people bring into relationships, often centers around doing more, saying more, planning more, initiating more. What actually tends to build security with an avoidant partner frequently looks like the opposite. Doing less in the sense of reducing pressure, reducing intensity, reducing the frequency of attempts to process or discuss the relationship's emotional state, while maintaining, underneath that reduced intensity, a completely steady baseline of genuine care that doesn't waver regardless of how much or how little engagement comes back in return. This reframing can feel deeply counterintuitive, even uncomfortable, for anyone whose natural instinct in a struggling relationship is to increase visible effort in hopes of fixing what feels broken. It's worth examining too how consistency across time, rather than intensity in any single moment, becomes the actual currency an avoidant nervous system deals in. Many people, understandably, hope that one deeply honest conversation, one particularly vulnerable disclosure, one especially well-executed gesture of reassurance, might finally produce the breakthrough that unlocks lasting security. This hope rarely plays out the way it's imagined, not because the specific gesture wasn't meaningful, but because avoidant nervous systems typically require repeated exposure to safety over extended time before genuinely updating their underlying threat assessment. A single instance of safety, however powerful in the moment, gets filed away as an exception rather than evidence of a new pattern. It's only through repetition, through the same steadiness showing up again and again across many different circumstances, that the underlying pattern recognition an avoidant partner depends on actually begins to shift. This is worth sitting with directly because it explains why relationships with avoidant partners so often require a kind of patience that feels almost disproportionate to what's being asked in any single moment. The patience isn't really about waiting for one big breakthrough. It's about accumulating, slowly and often invisibly, enough repeated evidence of steadiness that the avoidant partner's nervous system eventually has no remaining basis for its original threat assessment. This accumulation happens on a timeline largely outside anyone's direct control, shaped by the depth and duration of whatever earlier experiences built the original defensive pattern in the first place. There's a specific element worth naming about how this steadiness needs to extend into how conflict itself gets handled, because conflict often functions as the most rigorous test an avoidant partner's nervous system applies to any relationship. A partner who handles disagreement with escalating volume, ultimatums, or emotional flooding confirms the exact danger an avoidant nervous system associates with closeness. A partner who handles disagreement by staying present, communicating clearly without excessive intensity, and allowing space for both people's perspectives without needing immediate resolution demonstrates something far more valuable than any conflict-free relationship ever could, because it proves that disagreement itself doesn't have to threaten the relationship's underlying stability. Avoidant partners often don't need conflict to disappear entirely in order to feel safe. They need evidence that conflict, when it happens, doesn't produce catastrophe. It's worth exploring as well how this dynamic connects to something many people overlook entirely: the importance of a partner's relationship with their own emotional needs, independent of the avoidant partner's engagement or reassurance. An avoidant partner who senses that another person's entire sense of okayness depends on the state of the relationship, on whether the avoidant is currently engaged or withdrawn, experiences this as pressure, however unintentional, because it places responsibility for someone else's well-being directly on their own shoulders, precisely the kind of responsibility their defenses were built to avoid. A partner who maintains genuine well-being outside the relationship, whose emotional stability doesn't rise and fall based entirely on the avoidant's current level of engagement, offers something that feels considerably safer to approach because it removes the sense that their own withdrawal carries the weight of someone else's entire emotional state. For the listener who has spent considerable energy trying harder, doing more, offering increasingly visible effort in hopes of finally reaching an avoidant partner, there's something worth reconsidering here about where that energy might actually be better directed. Rather than asking what additional gesture or conversation might finally produce a breakthrough, it may be worth asking instead whether the underlying emotional weather being offered is genuinely steady, whether warmth remains consistent regardless of the avoidant's current level of engagement, and whether one's own sense of well-being has become too entangled with outcomes that were never fully within anyone's control to guarantee. These questions rarely produce the immediate satisfaction that visible effort provides, but they tend to build something considerably more durable over time than effort alone has ever managed to produce. There's a specific pattern worth examining here concerning how avoidant partners often test consistency without ever announcing that a test is happening. And understanding this dynamic can help make sense of behavior that otherwise feels confusing or even manipulative from the outside. It rarely takes the form of a conscious, deliberate strategy. More often, it emerges as an unconscious pattern of small withdrawals, minor tests of distance, brief periods of reduced engagement scattered throughout the relationship, each one quietly checking whether the response on the other end changes depending on how available or unavailable the avoidant partner happens to be in that particular moment. A partner whose warmth fluctuates in direct correlation with the avoidant's own engagement, growing cold when the avoidant pulls back and growing warm again once contact resumes, inadvertently confirms that affection here is conditional, precisely the pattern the avoidant nervous system is unconsciously screening for. A partner whose warmth remains recognizably stable throughout these fluctuations, neither collapsing into anxious pursuit during withdrawal nor punishing the withdrawal with matched coldness, offers evidence that contradicts the conditional pattern the avoidant has learned to expect from closeness. It's worth exploring what makes this particular kind of stability so much harder to fake or perform than visible effort tends to be. Grand gestures, thoughtful plans, carefully worded reassurance, all of these can be genuinely offered with love, but they can also, at times, be performed somewhat consciously, deployed strategically in hopes of producing a specific reaction. Genuine emotional steadiness during moments of withdrawal or disappointment is considerably harder to perform convincingly because it requires an actual internal state of security rather than simply the correct external behavior. Avoidant partners, despite their guardedness, often possess a heightened sensitivity to inauthenticity, having spent years learning to detect subtle signs that someone's warmth is strategic rather than genuine. This means the steadiness being described throughout this exploration cannot simply be adopted as a technique without the underlying emotional security to actually sustain it, which is part of why this entire process asks so much more of a partner than simply trying harder ever could. There's something worth naming about how childhood attachment experiences shape what specifically reads as safe to a given avoidant partner, because this isn't uniform across everyone who falls under this general attachment category. Some avoidants developed their guardedness in response to caregivers who were intrusive or overly enmeshed. And for these individuals, physical and emotional space itself becomes the primary marker of safety, meaning a partner who respects space without treating it as rejection communicates security particularly effectively. Other avoidants developed their patterns in response to caregivers who were emotionally unavailable or neglectful, and for these individuals, gentle, low-pressure availability, being reliably present without ever forcing engagement, often matters more than space itself. Understanding which particular flavour of avoidance a specific partner carries, something that often becomes clearer through patient observation over time rather than direct questioning, can help calibrate exactly what form of steadiness will land most effectively for that specific person. It's worth exploring too how this entire dynamic interacts with an avoidant partner's relationship to their own internal experience, because many avoidants struggle not just with expressing emotion outwardly, but with accurately identifying what they're feeling internally in the first place. This means an avoidant partner may genuinely be unable, in a given moment, to articulate why a particular gesture felt overwhelming or why a particular conversation triggered withdrawal, not because they're being evasive, but because the internal signal itself remains somewhat opaque even to them. This has important implications for how a partner interprets confusing or seemingly disproportionate reactions. Rather than assuming withdrawal always carries a specific, articulable reason that simply hasn't been shared, it can be more accurate and more compassionate to understand some withdrawal as a somewhat automatic nervous system response that the avoidant partner themselves doesn't fully understand or control, at least not without considerable self-reflective work they may not yet have undertaken. This distinction matters practically because it shifts the question away from what specifically triggered a given withdrawal and toward the broader pattern of whether steadiness continues to be offered regardless of the specific trigger. Trying to identify and eliminate every possible trigger for an avoidant partner's withdrawal is often an impossible and exhausting task because the triggers themselves are frequently inconsistent, shaped by factors entirely unrelated to the relationship: stress from work, unresolved family dynamics, simple fatigue that lowers overall tolerance for closeness on a given day. What remains consistent and controllable, regardless of the specific trigger, is the response offered on the other side. And this is precisely why steadiness, rather than attempts to prevent every possible instance of withdrawal, represents the more sustainable and ultimately more effective focus. There's a particular nuance worth naming about how this steadiness needs to be genuinely felt rather than merely displayed, because avoidant partners often develop unusually sensitive radar for the difference between authentic calm and suppressed frustration performing as calm. A partner who feels genuinely hurt or frustrated but masks this feeling with an outward display of composure, while the underlying frustration leaks through in subtle ways. Tone, body language, small passive comments often produces more confusion and distrust than simply expressing the frustration directly would. This means the steadiness being described throughout this exploration isn't primarily about controlling outward expression. It's about doing the deeper internal work necessary to actually feel less threatened by an avoidant partner's withdrawal. Work that often requires understanding one's own attachment patterns, addressing one's own anxieties about abandonment or rejection, and building genuine security independent of what the avoidant partner is currently offering. It's worth exploring as well how patience with this process connects to a broader question worth asking honestly and early, rather than avoiding indefinitely. Whether the relationship, even with ideal steadiness offered consistently, is likely to eventually meet a genuine need for reciprocal emotional availability, or whether it risks becoming a permanently one-sided arrangement where one partner does significant internal work while the other never develops corresponding capacity for closeness. This question doesn't have a universal answer, because avoidant partners vary enormously in their capacity and willingness to eventually grow toward greater security, some responding remarkably well to consistent patient steadiness over time, others remaining defended indefinitely, regardless of how ideal the conditions around them become. Honest, ongoing assessment of which pattern a specific relationship seems to be following matters considerably more than any general rule about how long patience should reasonably be extended. There's something worth naming, finally, about how this entire framework applies not just to romantic partnerships, but to any close relationship involving an avoidant person, including friendships and family relationships where the same underlying dynamics frequently show up in similar form. Whether the relationship in question is romantic, platonic, or familial, the same core distinction tends to hold. Visible effort alone rarely produces the security an avoidant person's nervous system is actually scanning for, while genuine, sustained emotional steadiness, offered without being contingent on how much engagement comes back in return, tends to matter far more, regardless of what specific form the relationship happens to take. It's worth naming too a common mistake that arises once someone genuinely understands and internalizes this distinction between effort and steadiness. The temptation to swing too far in the opposite direction, becoming so focused on projecting calm that genuine needs and preferences stop getting expressed at all. This overcorrection creates its own set of problems because a relationship built entirely around one partner suppressing their own needs in service of appearing perpetually unbothered isn't actually secure. It's simply a different flavor of avoidance, dressed up as patience. Genuine steadiness doesn't require pretending needs don't exist. It requires expressing those needs clearly and calmly, without the emotional flooding or escalation that tends to trigger withdrawal, while still remaining honest about what matters and what doesn't feel sustainable long term. A relationship where one partner never expresses any need at all isn't modeling safety. It's modeling self-erasure, and self-erasure, however well-intentioned, tends to produce its own quiet resentment over time, resentment that eventually leaks out in ways far less constructive than direct, calm communication would have been from the start. There's something worth exploring about how this steadiness interacts with the natural human need for occasional reassurance, because it would be inaccurate to suggest avoidant partners never respond well to direct expressions of care or affection. The distinction lies less in whether reassurance gets offered at all, and more in the frequency, intensity, and underlying motivation behind how it's offered. Reassurance offered occasionally, calmly, without any underlying urgency or need for immediate reciprocation, tends to land very differently than reassurance offered frequently, anxiously, with an implicit expectation that it needs to be matched or acknowledged in a specific way. The difference often comes down to whether the reassurance is being offered freely, as a genuine expression of feeling that doesn't require anything in return, or whether it's being offered as a kind of emotional transaction, seeking confirmation or relief from uncertainty that the avoidant partner's response is then expected to provide. It's worth examining as well how this entire dynamic shifts once a relationship moves into longer-term commitment, cohabitation, marriage, or shared parenting, because the stakes and complexity of maintaining steadiness change considerably once daily logistics, financial entanglement, and shared responsibility enter the picture. In these deeper stages, small moments of friction happen far more frequently simply because there's more shared life requiring coordination, and this increased frequency of minor conflict can make sustained steadiness considerably more demanding to maintain than it was during an earlier, less entangled stage of the relationship. Partners navigating this deeper stage often benefit from explicitly naming, out loud and together, when they notice old patterns of anxious pursuit or defensive withdrawal beginning to resurface, treating these moments as opportunities for course correction rather than evidence that the relationship's underlying security has failed. There's a particular consideration worth naming about how this framework applies differently, depending on whether both partners share some degree of avoidant tendency or whether one partner leans more anxious while the other leans more avoidant, because these two configurations produce meaningfully different relational dynamics. Two avoidant partners together often struggle less with the specific patterns described throughout this exploration, since neither person is pursuing intensely or requiring the kind of steady reassurance being discussed here, but they may face a different challenge entirely, a relationship that remains comfortably distant without ever developing the depth either partner secretly wants but struggles to initiate. An anxious partner paired with an avoidant partner faces the dynamic most directly described throughout this exploration, and this configuration often requires the anxious partner to do considerable work on their own attachment patterns simultaneously, building enough internal security that steadiness becomes genuinely sustainable rather than a constant effortful performance fighting against their own natural instincts toward pursuit and reassurance seeking. For the listener trying to determine which of these configurations best describes their own relationship, it's worth noting that most people carry some blend of both tendencies depending on context, rather than fitting neatly into a single category across every relationship and circumstance. Understanding one's own patterns, honestly, ideally with the support of a therapist or counselor familiar with attachment theory, often proves just as important as understanding an avoidant partner's patterns, because sustainable steadiness ultimately depends on both partners doing genuine internal work rather than one person single-handedly managing the emotional climate of the entire relationship indefinitely. Understanding what an avoidant partner is actually responding to doesn't guarantee that any relationship will succeed, and it doesn't obligate anyone to indefinitely offer steadiness to a partner who never demonstrates any corresponding movement towards safety over time. What this understanding does offer is clarity, a way of recognizing that the exhausting cycle of increasing effort in hopes of finally being met halfway was likely never going to produce the outcome being hoped for, regardless of how much additional effort got poured into it. Real security, if it develops at all, tends to grow from something quieter and more sustained than effort alone, and recognizing this distinction, however counterintuitive it feels at first, often represents the first genuine step toward either building something lasting or recognizing with real clarity that lasting security was never actually available in this particular relationship at all. What remains true, regardless of which outcome ultimately unfolds, is that the shift itself, from chasing visible proof of care toward quietly embodying real, sustained, and genuine steadiness, tends to change something meaningful and lasting in the person practicing it, independent of whatever the avoidant partner eventually does or does not do in return. And regardless of what ultimately ends up happening to that specific relationship itself over the long run of time,